Rain clung to the stones of St. Haven's Hall like a thin veil of sorrow, turning the grand entrance into a blurred mirror of lantern light and restless carriages. Within those marble walls, where violins floated like fragile promises, Lady Evelyn Harcourt stepped with a poise that cost her more than anyone could guess. Her gown was a careful revival of her late mother's silk, restored thread by trembling thread, and though its style had long slipped from fashionable circles, she carried it with the grace of someone determined to pretend she still belonged among the glittering elite. The ceremony had been swift, efficient, and colder than the winter air pressing through the stained-glass windows. Duke Adrian Ravenscroft, the kingdom's most coveted bachelor, stood beside her as if fulfilling a civic duty rather than a vow. He was all immaculate composure, dark hair perfectly kept, expression unreadable, shoulders held in an unyielding line that felt more military than matrimonial. Evelyn had tried to meet his gaze when the priest spoke of eternal constancy, but his eyes drifted past her, fixed on some distant obligation she could not see. When the vows concluded, applause rose like hollow thunder. Adrian offered his arm because etiquette demanded it, and she accepted because she had no other choice. They walked the length of the aisle, she with fragile hope, he with impenetrable restraint, toward a future neither fully understood. The guests leaned in, whispering behind feathered fans and gleaming cufflinks. Evelyn caught shards of their murmurs. A Harcourt? How unexpected! He could have chosen anyone. Perhaps he was coerced. Each fragment pressed into her like a dull blade. In a private corridor beyond the hall, the air cooled, and silence stretched thin. Adrian stopped, withdrawing his arm as though her touch burned. For a fleeting moment, his facade cracked. She thought she glimpsed genuine regret etched in the line of his mouth. "My lady," he said softly, but not tenderly. "I must speak plainly." She steadied her breath. "Of course, your grace. You shall spend the wedding night alone." The words struck harder than any slap. Not spoken cruelly, nor with disdain, almost gently, but with a finality that allowed no room for questions. Yet 1,000 questions surged within her. Why marry her at all? Why treat her with this distant mercy? Why cloak every gesture in formality? Her throat tightened. "If that is your wish, I must honor it," she replied, each syllable a quiet battle to keep her voice from trembling. Dignity was all she had left. She would not let it shatter so soon. His jaw flexed, something like anguish flickering across his expression, there and gone. "It is necessary," he murmured, "for reasons I cannot yet disclose." Then he stepped back, leaving her in the half-lit corridor as though retreating from danger. When she returned to the hall, the gossip had already bloomed. Conversations hushed as she passed, fans lowered to reveal lips curled in intrigue. A baroness whispered too loudly, "Did you see how pale she looked? The poor girl must sense the truth." Another replied, "A loveless union from the very start." Her cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin, refusing to let them see the bruise forming in her heart. The reception blurred into a series of polite torments. Forced smiles, hollow congratulations, and dance invitations delivered more out of obligation than admiration. The Duke remained distant, speaking only to statesmen and older relatives, as though he had wed an idea rather than a living woman. Evelyn felt herself drifting through the evening like a ghost tethered to ceremony, each moment elongating her humiliation. At last, near midnight, she was escorted to Ravenscroft Manor's bridal suite, a chamber of opulent solitude. Soft candlelight flickered upon embroidered drapes, gilded mirrors, and a bed far too large for one. A fire crackled warmly, indifferent to the loneliness swelling around her. She removed her gloves slowly, listening to the faint murmur of servants departing down the hall, their footsteps fading into nothing. She inhaled deeply, willing herself not to cry. Tears were too easily earned by society, and she refused to give it the satisfaction. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she considered the strange contours of her new life, married yet abandoned, protected yet exposed. Was she a pawn in a game she had not agreed to play? Then she saw it. Resting upon the pillow, crisp white against the embroidered gold, was a sealed letter bearing the Duke's crest. Her pulse quickened. She reached for it with hesitant fingers, the wax cool beneath her thumb. The seal was unbroken, untouched, left for her and only her. The handwriting within was unmistakably his, measured strokes, deliberate spacing, the script of a man who rarely permitted sentiment to disturb precision. Yet the slight tremor in several letters betrayed an inner turmoil she had never associated with him. As Evelyn read, a cold thread of dread tightened around her ribs. Adrian wrote of duties inherited rather than chosen, of obligations forged in desperation, and of a danger that shadowed his every step. He confessed that marrying her had been the only shield he could raise against forces determined to exploit his vulnerabilities. Though he offered no names, no specifics, the gravity behind each restrained sentence made her breath falter. It was not rejection he dealt her but protection, misguided, secretive, suffocating. And in the space between his words, she sensed a man fighting a battle he refused to place upon her shoulders. The implications of his secrecy unsettled her more than silence ever could. The implications deepened her unease and sharpened her curiosity. What she read inside would change everything. Dawn crept reluctantly over Ravenscroft Manor, its pale light washing the estate in a muted hush, as though even the sun feared to intrude upon Evelyn's restless thoughts. She had slept little, her mind circling the Duke's letter like a moth drawn to a flame that promised warmth yet threatened ruin. When she rose, the remnants of her wedding gown lay draped over a chair as if abandoned by a bride who had fled. She touched the silk absently, unsure whether the night had carved strength into her or simply deepened the hollow within her chest. A maid entered with timid curtsy, announcing breakfast, and Evelyn descended the grand staircase with the poise of a woman determined not to appear bruised. Yet each step echoed with the memory of Adrian's quiet decree, a whisper that seemed to follow her like a shadow. The breakfast salon shimmered with polished crystal and early sunlight, but beneath its elegance simmered the unmistakable tension of a household uncertain how to greet its new mistress. Footmen stood too straight, maids hovered too cautiously. Evelyn seated herself at the head of the table, a position she felt she had not earned, and forced her hands to remain steady as tea was poured. It was then she noticed a small velvet box placed beside her plate. No one claimed responsibility for it, but its presence was unmistakable, the Duke's seal etched into the clasp. Her pulse quickened. Lifting the lid, she found a delicate brooch carved in the shape of a larkspur, petals rendered in sapphires pale as morning frost. She recognized the flower's meaning at once, a heart misjudged. The symbolism baffled her, stirring equal parts hope and confusion. Why offer her distance with one hand and apology with the other? She fastened it to her gown, though uncertainty prickled beneath her resolve. When she arrived at the conservatory for morning tea with the visiting ladies, an unavoidable ritual for a newly wedded duchess, she felt their eyes converge upon the brooch. Their curiosity sharpened like needles wrapped in silk. Lady Breckham, known for her gentle cruelty, leaned forward with a sympathetic smile that never reached her gaze. "Such a charming piece, Lady Ravenscroft. A wedding gift from your husband, I presume." Evelyn managed a composed nod, though her throat tightened at the subtle emphasis on presume. Whispers rippled among the guests. "How lovely! How unexpected! How strange!" The larkspur glimmered beneath the shifting light, a beacon drawing scrutiny she had hoped to avoid. Evelyn lifted her chin, determined not to falter, though every murmur pressed upon her fragile composure. By noon, the whispering had migrated from delicate parlor talk to the unrestrained hunger of the city's social circles. And by late afternoon, it reached its cruel crescendo. A footman approached her in the gallery, pale and hesitant, holding a folded newspaper as though it were evidence of a crime. Evelyn accepted it with a steady hand, though dread pooled coldly within her. On the front page, an illustrated caricature captured her likeness in exaggerated lines. Wide, timid eyes, hands clasped in forlorn expectation, seated alone upon the edge of a grand bed. Above it, in bold lettering, the caption twisted like a knife, "The Lonely Duchess." Her breath caught. Ink had turned private humiliation into public mockery. The article beneath speculated freely. A marriage of convenience? A union devoid of affection? Each sentence chipped away at her dignity, and she felt the walls of the gallery narrow around her. She did not hear Adrian approach, only sensed him, an abrupt shift in the air, a quiet stillness that belonged solely to him. When she turned, his eyes were not cold but troubled, darkened by something she could not yet name. For a moment, neither spoke. The newspaper fluttered slightly in her trembling grasp. He extended a hand, silently requesting it. She hesitated, then surrendered the paper. As he scanned the page, A muscle in his jaw tightened. "This," he said at last, voice low and controlled, "is an intrusion I had hoped to prevent." She searched his expression for explanation, for remorse, for anything that resembled the man hinted at in his letter. But he folded the newspaper with clinical precision, concealing whatever emotion roiled beneath the surface. Before she could speak, he inclined his head in a gesture both apologetic and distancing, then stepped back, as if proximity itself endangered them both. That evening, the manor felt perceptibly altered. Servants moved with a hush usually reserved for sickness or mourning. Evelyn wandered the quiet corridors, her thoughts a swirl of indignation, confusion, and unwilling fascination. She found herself returning to the brooch, tracing the larkspur's contours as if it might divulge its maker's intent. She wondered whether Adrian had left it out of regret, obligation, or something far more complicated. Yet the memory of his retreating figure that morning suggested he feared the consequences of closeness more than the cruelty of distance. She paused at the landing overlooking the ballroom, recalling how every eye had watched her the previous night, seeking cracks in her composure. Perhaps the world expected her to shatter. Perhaps Adrian expected it too. When she reached her writing desk, she noticed something she was certain had not been there earlier, an oval portrait framed in silver, placed with deliberate care beside her inkwell. The woman depicted bore warm eyes and a serene smile, Adrian's mother, whom Evelyn had only seen in old estate paintings. A note lay beneath it in the Duke's unmistakable script. Her breath caught as she unfolded the paper, recognizing the same mixture of restraint and vulnerability she had found in his first letter. "Forgive what you cannot yet understand. Nothing more." No signature, no explanation. Yet the gesture, offering his mother's likeness, felt intimate in a way that clashed with every boundary he had set. Evelyn held the portrait gently, sensing the quiet tragedy of a man divided between duty and desire. And in that fragile stillness, she felt the first tremor of something shifting, a truth approaching with the inevitability of a storm. Rain hammered against the windows of Ravenscroft Manor as though the night itself sought entry, rattling the panes with a relentless urgency that mirrored Evelyn's thoughts. She wandered the dim corridors with a candle trembling in her grasp, unable to sleep beneath the weight of the scandal that had devoured the day. Each whisper replayed in her mind, sharpened by humiliation, softened only by the inexplicable tenderness of the portrait Adrian had left for her. Stormlight flickered through the hallway, illuminating the frame she carried with her, a reminder that her husband's heart was not entirely unreachable. Yet the uncertainty woven into his gestures unsettled her more deeply than outright cruelty ever could. The library welcomed her with the scent of old leather and smoldering embers. A fire crackled low in the hearth, casting warm light across velvet chairs and towering bookcases. She believed herself alone until a quiet shift of movement broke the stillness. Adrian stood near the window, rain streaming behind him like silver threads, his silhouette a dark contrast against the storm. He turned slowly, surprise flickering across his usually unruffled expression. His coat clung damply to broad shoulders, his hair slightly disordered, lending him a rare, unguarded humanity. "I did not realize anyone else sought refuge here," he said, his voice low, softened by exhaustion rather than indifference. Evelyn clutched the candle-holder a little tighter. "I could not sleep." The understatement hovered between them, fragile and painfully honest. Adrian stepped closer to the hearth, removing his gloves with stiff motions. "I imagine the day has been unkind." The way he said it, quiet, remorseful, made her chest constrict. She approached the fire, holding her hands toward its warmth. "Your Grace, the whispers about us, the caricature, they wounded more than I expected." She swallowed, feeling her dignity wobble. "But what I cannot understand is why you choose silence when a single word from you could dispel so much." His gaze lowered to the flames, reflecting orange sparks in eyes darkened by conflict. "Some truths, Lady Evelyn, do more harm when spoken." Her frustration, long restrained, slipped into her voice. "And does secrecy not wound as well? Must I stand alone in the shadows of your making?" He exhaled, the sound heavy with emotion he seldom allowed himself to show. "I never intended for you to stand alone." He glanced at her, the moment stretched taut. "But I cannot bear the thought of you standing beside me in danger." The admission silenced her. She watched him, noticing how his shoulders seemed weighed down not by duty, but by fear carefully concealed beneath stoic restraint. "Danger," she repeated. "You write of obligations and threats, yet you do not trust me with the truth." He flinched subtly, as though her words struck with uncanny precision. "Trust has never been the issue," he murmured. "Then what is?" The storm outside punctuated her question with a thunderous crack. Adrian turned from the fire, pacing slowly as though wrestling with an unseen force. "You deserve a marriage built upon warmth and constancy," he said. "Not one shackled to shadows I inherited long before you entered my life." She stepped toward him, compelled by an instinct that defied carefully taught propriety. "Perhaps," she said softly, "I should be allowed to decide what I deserve." His breath caught. Their closeness felt electric, the air thick with unspoken longing. Firelight painted his features in amber and gold, revealing a weariness that made him look almost mortal. He lifted a hand as if to touch her, then let it fall before the gesture could betray him further. "My presence places you at risk," he said. "Keeping distance was intended as protection." "And yet it feels like rejection," she whispered. His expression cracked, just faintly, but enough to reveal the heart beneath the armor. "Evelyn, if you knew how often I think of you, how deeply your disappointment unsettles me." He cut himself off, jaw tight. "The night of our wedding, I nearly turned back. Another pause. Distance is all I have left to keep you from harm." She felt the embers of her courage glow brighter. "Your grace, harm already finds me. The world mocks me. Your silence feeds their cruelty. If danger comes regardless, why should I face it blindfolded?" Adrian closed his eyes for a brief, tortured moment. "Because the danger is tied to me alone. I will not allow it to touch you." Her voice softened, trembling despite her resolve. "Then allow me to stand beside you, not behind walls of your choosing. You offered me your name, but not your truth." He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze fully for the first time that night. Something unspoken passed between them: fear, longing, regret, and an ache neither had the language to voice. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and brushed his fingers against hers. The contact was brief, fleeting as a heartbeat, yet it ignited a warmth that spread through her like fire catching dry tinder. "I am trying," he said quietly. "More than you know." She held his gaze. "Then begin by allowing me in." Before he could reply, the library doors burst open. A servant stood breathless, his face bloodless with urgency. "Your Graces," he stammered, "another scandal has appeared in the evening papers." Adrian straightened, composure snapping back into place, though alarm flickered beneath the surface. Evelyn felt the fragile connection between them tighten rather than break, as though the storm outside had leapt inward, binding their fates with sudden force. The servant hesitated, eyes darting nervously between them, before adding in a trembling voice, "This one, it questions the very reason for your marriage." Evelyn's breath seized. Adrian's hand, still close to hers, curled slightly, as if bracing for a blow he knew too well. A chill swept through the room, stirring the firelight as Evelyn realized the scandal threatened not only her reputation but their fragile, growing bond. The morning after the library confession dawned with a brittle, deceptive calm, as though the world wished to pretend nothing had fractured the night before. Yet the scandal had spread like wildfire. Before Evelyn reached the breakfast salon, a footman discreetly handed Adrian the newspaper that had ignited society's appetite once more. She caught only a glimpse of the headline before he tucked it under his arm. A calculated union? Duchess accused of ambitious deceit. The caricature beneath showed her not as lonely this time but scheming, eyes narrowed, fingers wrapped around a purse spilling coins. The cruelty of it stole her breath. Adrian dismissed the servants with a sharp gesture, then turned to Evelyn, his expression unreadable but for a storm hidden beneath the surface. "You will not read it," he said. Not an order, but a plea disguised in authority. She met his gaze with quiet courage. "The world has already read it. Why must I be the only one left in ignorance?" He hesitated, the newspaper crumpling faintly beneath his tightening grip. "Because it is a lie crafted to wound you." and because I should have shielded you from such venom. You cannot shield me from what already circulates through every drawing-room in London, she replied. The ache in her voice was soft, but it cut through him. But you can stand beside me. For a moment, he looked as though he might say something earnest, something impossible, but instead he turned away. Be dressed for the outing at noon, he said. There is a matter I must address. She watched him leave, realizing with sudden clarity that he had reached a breaking point. Whether it would bring him closer to her or further apart, she could not yet know. When noon arrived, Evelyn descended the front steps to find a carriage unlike any she had used before. Black lacquer gleaming, the Ravenscroft crest shining boldly, and footmen lined with military precision. Adrian waited inside, immaculate, tense, a man carved from resolve. The horses surged forward as soon as she entered, carrying them through London's bustling streets where gossip fluttered like sparrows on every corner. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To the source," he answered. The carriage halted before the grand steps of the Royal Conservatory, where a charity ball was underway, one attended by every voice that shaped society's opinions. The air shimmered with silk, jewels, and barely concealed fascination as the Duke and Duchess stepped into view. Conversations stalled. Fans paused mid-flutter. People stared with unabashed hunger. Evelyn felt her stomach tighten, but Adrian extended his arm in a gesture so deliberate, so public, that an audible murmur rippled through the crowd. It was not the stiff courtesy he had offered at their wedding. This was a declaration. She placed her hand upon his arm, and he covered it with his gloved hand, a rare intimacy that struck the observers silent. He leaned toward her just slightly. "Today," he murmured, "no one shall doubt where you stand." They entered the ballroom transformed by chandeliers dripping crystal light and an orchestra swelling with triumphant music. Yet beneath the grandeur, the air quivered with unsaid questions. Adrian guided Evelyn toward the center of the room, where the patronesses of the event whispered behind lace fans. Lady Breckham's eyes widened with eager malice, until Adrian stopped directly before her. "Your Grace," she said, feigning innocence. "How lovely to see you both. I trust the morning papers." Adrian cut her off, his tone polite but edged with steel. "Printed a falsehood that I will now correct." His voice carried across the room, commanding every ear. "My marriage was neither calculated nor coerced. It was, and remains, an alliance I chose." A stunned hush fell. Evelyn felt the words strike her like a warm shock. For the first time, he acknowledged her not as an obligation but as a choice. He continued, eyes sweeping the room. "Any who question the Duchess's virtue question my own honor. And that," he added quietly, dangerously, "is something I will not tolerate." A ripple of respect, tinged with fear, passed through the gathering. Lady Breckham's lips tightened, her fan snapping shut with a soft crack. The orchestra hesitated, uncertain, until Adrian offered Evelyn his hand for a dance. It was the most intimate gesture imaginable in that setting, a silent vow spoken before the world. She accepted, heart thundering. As they moved across the polished floor, whispers softened into awe. The Duke's gaze remained fixed upon her, steady and unguarded. "You did not have to do this," she whispered. "I did," he replied. "Not because society demanded it, but because I could not bear to see you diminished by lies." His grip tightened gently at her waist. "Nor by my silence." Her breath faltered. He had broken his vow of distance. He had chosen her, here, before all who doubted her. And yet she sensed something deeper stirring in him, something that frightened him more than any scandal. When the dance ended, he guided her to a quieter alcove lined with orchids glowing under lantern light. The sudden privacy made the world seem distant. "There is more I must tell you," he said. "But I ask your permission to speak plainly." "You already have it," she answered. He exhaled, as though relieved. "I care for you, Evelyn, more deeply than I anticipated, more than I have allowed myself to show. These past days have exposed truths I can no longer deny." Her heart surged, but she steadied her voice. "Then why the distance?" He looked away, anguish tightening every line of his face. "Because there are dangers tied to my family, debtors of honor, threats I inherited, that I fear may reach you if our closeness becomes known. I thought by holding you at arm's length, I spared you. You did not spare me, she said. You isolated me. His gaze returned to hers, raw and searching. Then let me ask what I should have asked from the beginning. May I court you properly, though we are already wed? Emotion swept through her, surprise, relief, longing, but beneath it, the unshakable need for truth. Yes, she whispered. If you will no longer hide from me. He lifted her hand to his lips, brushing a kiss upon her knuckles, a gesture that sent quiet fire through her. I will not hide, he vowed. But before she could savor the promise, a breathless messenger approached, bowing low. Your Grace, urgent news from Ravenscroft Manor. Adrian's expression darkened. Evelyn's pulse quickened. What news? She asked. The messenger swallowed hard. It concerns the threat you feared, Your Grace. It has resurfaced. Night draped Hawthorne House in a velvet hush, as though the world itself had paused to witness their unspoken fate. Evelyn stepped across the threshold of the chamber that had once terrified her, feeling the weight of memory press softly against her ribs. This was the room she had expected to enter alone on their wedding night, a sanctuary turned punishment by a single sentence he now regretted. Tonight, however, every candle seemed lit in apology, trembling with a warmth that beckoned her closer. She moved slowly, as if afraid her presence might shatter the fragile hope suspended in the scented air. Behind her, the Duke's footsteps approached with a steadiness that contradicted the storm twisting inside him. When he closed the door, the soft click felt like the binding of a vow he had run from for far too long. Evelyn did not turn, though she felt his gaze brush her shoulders like the faintest ghost of a confession. He had spent days unraveling the threads of his pride, each revelation pointing him back to the woman he had wronged. I feared what I could not name, he said finally, his voice a muted ember in the dim glow. And in fearing it, I wounded the only soul who ever sought to understand me. Evelyn's fingers grazed the polished edge of the writing desk, steadying herself against the tenderness threading through his words. Your fear was not my burden to carry, she replied, each syllable careful, yet trembling with an ache she no longer wished to hide. He stepped closer, stopping a breath behind her, his presence igniting the quiet space between apology and desire. No, he murmured, but I placed it upon you regardless, and for that I cannot forgive myself. At last she turned, meeting the depth in his eyes that had so often concealed what they now surrendered freely. The fire crackled behind him, casting gold along his jaw and softening the shadows that had once guarded his every secret. Tell me, she whispered, why now? His jaw tensed, not with defiance, but with the weight of a truth too long imprisoned beneath duty and mourning. Because the thought of you walking through this house believing yourself unwanted has become unbearable. She felt the confession settle inside her, delicate as snow yet heavy with the promise of change. He extended a hand, not commanding, but offering, as though asking permission to rewrite the night he had stolen. For a moment she only stared, her breath laced with disbelief, remembering every whispered rumor and cold glance endured in silence. But the man before her was no longer the distant Duke shaped by society's expectations. He was simply Gabriel, flawed and fiercely sincere. She placed her hand in his, feeling the tremor beneath his controlled composure, a vulnerability he rarely allowed even himself. He drew her nearer, not with urgency, but with a reverence that softened the air between them. If you command me to leave, he said quietly, I shall obey without protest. But if you permit me to remain, I will spend every breath proving that you are cherished beyond measure. Her pulse fluttered at the sincerity woven through his vow, its earnestness outshining any practiced charm he once wielded. She studied him closely, searching for hesitation and finding none, only a man stripped bare of pretense. Then stay, she said, the words fragile, but anchored in the courage that had always lived quietly within her. Relief washed over his features, fleeting yet profound, as though she had lifted an invisible burden from his soul. He guided her toward the hearth, where the fire painted their silhouettes in flickering warmth. For a moment they stood without speaking, letting the silence knit a new beginning between them. Evelyn felt a shift, subtle yet undeniable, as though fate had finally exhaled after holding its breath too long. You deserved tenderness, he said, not abandonment masquerading as honor. She touched his sleeve, the gesture small but brave, allowing her heart to echo what her voice could not yet bear to release. His hand covered hers, warm and steady, grounding her in the possibility they now stepped toward together. Outside, the wind swept across the estate, stirring the ivy that clung fiercely to the ancient stone walls. Inside, the world seemed to shrink to the quiet rhythm of two hearts relearning trust. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss so gentle it felt like a promise written upon her skin. Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from the realization that she no longer stood alone in her longing. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "let the world gossip as it wishes. Tonight belongs only to us, as it always should have." She felt his words wrap around her like silken threads, mending the tear left by that first cruel night. With a steady inhale, she leaned closer, allowing vulnerability to guide her where fear once reigned. Their foreheads touched, a simple gesture that held the weight of 1,000 unsent letters and unspoken hopes. And as the firelight swayed, painting them in gold, Evelyn realized the night she had been denied was finally coming for her.